The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Friday, Harriet Dawson had packed everything she owned into a single trunk and boarded the eastbound stage headed west. "You cannot be serious," the man said, and his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made lesser men step backward off porches. August Townsend stood at the boundary line between his land and the Dawson parcel, his hat pushed back on his head, his jaw set like carved oak, and his gray eyes fixed on Harriet with an expression she could not quite read. It was not contempt. It was not dismissal. It was something far more complicated and far more dangerous than either of those things, and it made her chest go tight in a way she had no patience for. "I am entirely serious," Harriet said, and she held the deed with both hands even though the October wind was doing its level best to rip it away from her. "This land belonged to my father. He is dead. It belongs to me now, and that fence you have erected on the eastern boundary is sitting 6 feet inside my property line." August did not flinch. "That fence has been standing for 2 years, and it has been wrong for 2 years. The silence between them was the kind that had weight. Harriet could feel it pressing against her sternum, and she refused to let it show on her face. She was 26 years old. She had ridden 3 days on a stage coach with a broken spring. She had slept 2 nights in a roadside inn that smelled of old leather and horse sweat, and she had arrived at her late father's property to find the farmhouse shuttered, the well dry, the barn listing to one side, and a fence that did not belong where it stood. She was exhausted. She was grieving. And she was furious in that deep, cold way that does not announce itself with shouting. August took the deed from her hands before she registered the movement. His fingers were careful, precise, and he studied the paper with the focus of a man who reads documents seriously. The wind caught a strand of his dark hair and pulled it across his forehead, and Harriet found herself noticing that detail with a kind of annoyance directed entirely at herself. She was not here to notice things about neighbors. She was here to reclaim what was hers. "The survey marker was moved," he said finally, and when he looked up his expression had shifted. The hard set of his jaw had softened by a degree she almost missed. "I did not move it." "Then who did?" He handed the deed back to her. "That is a very good question, Miss Dawson. And the answer to it is going to complicate things considerably." That was the moment, she would later think, when everything began. Not the long stage ride west. Not the telegram from the county land office informing her that her father, Clement Dawson, had passed of a fever in late August, leaving behind 160 acres of Colorado Territory farmland and a farmhouse that had seen better decades. Not the argument she had with her aunt in Kansas City, who had urged her to sell the land sight unseen to a buyer who had already made inquiries. The moment that everything truly began was that one sentence delivered by a man with wind-pulled hair and honest gray eyes standing at the border of a disputed fence line on a cold October morning. "The answer to it is going to complicate things considerably." Harriet had not expected to feel anything when she stepped off the stage in Caldwell Creek, Colorado, in the autumn of 1879. She had not expected the way the mountains sat against the sky like they had been painted there, enormous and indifferent and brutally beautiful. She had not expected the smell of the sage or the particular quality of the light at high altitude, or the way the whole landscape made her feel simultaneously very small and very awake. She had grown up in St. Louis, moved to Kansas City after her mother passed when she was 19, and had spent the 7 years since working as a seamstress and a sometime school teacher, and generally conducting herself as a practical woman who did not indulge in sentiment. She had met her father fewer than a dozen times in her life. Clement Dawson had gone west when she was 4 years old, chasing land grants and the particular kind of hope that could not survive east of the Missouri River. He had written letters, intermittently, in handwriting that slanted uphill on every line as though the words were trying to escape the page. He had sent money twice, when she was 12, and when she was 18, modest amounts that had nonetheless arrived at moments when they were needed. He had not come back. She had understood in the unspoken language that children develop around absent parents, that he had made his choice, and that she had not been the centerpiece of it. And then, 7 weeks ago, she had received the letter from the county land registrar informing her that she was the sole heir of one Clement Dawson, deceased, and that if she wished to maintain ownership of the property, she would need to appear in person within 6 months to file the appropriate claims and pay the outstanding taxes. Her aunt had called it a burden. Her best friend Louisa had called it an adventure. Harriet had called it hers, because whatever complicated and unresolved feelings she carried about her father, the land was a fact, and facts were the things she knew how to deal with. She had arrived in Caldwell Creek on a Thursday evening when the general store was still lit, and the saloon on the main street was producing the kind of sounds that suggested the evening was just getting started. She had checked into the only boarding house in town, a clean establishment run by a Mrs. Beaumont who charged fair rates and asked very few questions, and she had spent that first night lying on a narrow mattress listening to the wind move across the high country and thinking about what came next. What came next, she had decided by morning, was that she would walk out to the Dawson parcel, which was 2.5 miles from town, according to the directions the land registrar had given her, and she would assess the situation with her own eyes before she let anyone else assess it for her. The walk out had been long and cold and extraordinary in the way that high country mornings are extraordinary, every breath of air tasting like something that had never been inside a building. The Dawson parcel sat on a slight rise above a creek that ran along its southern edge, and she could see from the road that the farmhouse was old but structurally sound in the way that old things sometimes are when they have been built well and left alone. The roof needed new shingles on the north-facing side. The front porch boards were soft in 2 places. The barn was better than she had initially feared from a distance, its listing more visual than structural. The well was dry, but there was a creek, and wells could be deepened. She had been walking the perimeter of the property, deed in hand and a surveyor's copy she had obtained from the land office tucked under her arm, when she reached the eastern boundary and found the fence. It was a good fence. That was the first thing she noticed, and she noted it with the kind of grudging respect one gives to good workmanship regardless of its placement. Cedar posts, well set, with neat strands of wire between them. Someone had taken care with it. Someone had built it to last. And it was 6 feet inside the Dawson property line, according to both the deed and the surveyor's copy, which meant that 6 feet of her land was currently enclosed within someone else's pasture. She had been standing at the fence, calculating the math of that encroachment and what it would mean for the section of the creek that ran through the disputed strip, when she heard the horse. The rider was tall in the saddle, a dark bay horse moving at a collected walk with the easy confidence of an animal that was well trained and well cared for. The man riding him was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or 2 more, with the kind of lean, weathered build that a life outdoors produces. He wore a dark coat and a felt hat, and the expression of a man who had observed something on his property that required investigation, and had come to investigate it in a calm and orderly fashion. He pulled the bay horse to a stop on his side of the fence and looked at Harriet for a moment without speaking. "You are on the Dawson parcel," he said. "I am Harriet Dawson," she said, "and so I am." That had been the beginning of the beginning. The fence dispute had been the opening note, but it had not been the whole music, and Harriet would spend the following weeks learning that lesson in one form or another on a daily basis. After their first conversation at the fence line, August Townsend had ridden back to his own property without another word, and Harriet had stood holding her deed in the October wind thinking that the man was either deeply thoughtful or profoundly rude, and that time would reveal which. She walked back to town, ate a meal at Mrs. Beaumont's table, and spent the evening making a list. The list was practical. The well needed deepening. The roof needed 12 new courses of shingles on the north face, and spot repairs on the east. The porch boards needed replacing on the 3rd and 7th planks from the door. The barn needed a new leather hinge on the large door and some chinked gaps in the north wall. The kitchen garden had gone to weeds, but the soil looked rich. The small apple orchard her father had apparently planted along the western edge of the property was still alive. 5 trees with the skeletal look of things that had been neglected but not killed. The wood stove in the farmhouse worked. The kitchen pump was dry, but was connected to a cistern that could be refilled from the creek. The beds were stripped bare, but the frames were sound. She had also written on a separate page the things she did not yet know. She did not know who had moved the survey marker. She did not know why. She did not know what her father's relationship with his neighbor had been. She did not know whether the land itself was viable for the kind of small-scale farming she had in mind, whether the growing season at this elevation was long enough for the wheat she was considering, whether the water rights on the creek were contested or clear. She did not know whether the man on the dark bay horse was a straight dealer or someone with his own agenda. She found out some of these things the following morning. She was on the porch of the farmhouse with a crowbar and a box of nails, working on the 3rd plank from the door, when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching on the track that led from the main road to the farmhouse. She straightened and turned, and the wagon was August Townsend's, a flatbed with a half-dozen cedar planks laid across the bed and a keg of nails wedged against the front board, and August himself sitting the driver's seat with the calm of a man who had decided on a course of action and was seeing it through. He pulled the horse to a stop in the yard and climbed down without haste. "I brought lumber," he said. Harriet looked at the lumber. She looked at him. She said, "I can see that. Your porch boards will not last the winter. I am already replacing them. You will need more than what you have." He lifted 2 of the cedar planks from the wagon bed as though they weighed nothing, which they did not, and carried them to the porch steps. He set them down and turned back for more. Harriet stood with the crowbar in her hand and watched him do this. She was not certain what to make of it. In her experience, men did not appear with wagon loads of lumber for women they had argued with the previous morning unless there was something they wanted. She was not naive about that. She had grown up in circumstances that had required her to understand early that generosity in this world almost always had a cost attached somewhere downstream. "What do you want for this?" she asked. He paused in the middle of lifting the 3rd plank and looked at her over his shoulder. The expression on his face was not offense exactly, but it was something adjacent to it, something that looked like a man recalibrating his expectations. "Nothing," he said. "That is not a credible answer." He set the plank down and turned to face her fully. "Miss Dawson, your father was my neighbor for 11 years. He was a decent man and an honest one. He loaned me fence wire the first winter I was here when mine blew down in a November storm and I had nothing to replace it with. He loaned me his draft horse when mine went lame before the spring planting. He did not once ask me what I wanted for it." He paused. "I am bringing you lumber because your father is gone, and because you are here alone, and because the porch boards will collapse before December if they are not replaced. That is all." Harriet stood very still for a moment. The wind moved through the apple trees on the western edge of the property, and somewhere down toward the creek a bird was doing something complicated and musical. "Thank you," she said. She said it plainly, without the guardedness that had been in her voice before, because the speech he had given had the sound of truth, and she had always been able to recognize truth when she heard it. They worked on the porch together that morning, and it was work that required close quarters and occasional coordination, one person holding a board while the other drove nails, and it produced the particular kind of conversation that comes from people doing physical tasks side by side. Conversation that arrives in pieces between efforts, without the formal structure of social exchange. Harriet learned that August Townsend had come to Colorado in 1872 at the age of 23 from a farm in Virginia that had been lost to debt following the war. She learned that he had worked cattle drives for 2 years before he had saved enough to file a homestead claim on the land adjacent to her father's parcel. She learned that he had spent 7 years building the Townsend operation from a single dwelling and a few head of cattle to a working ranch with a proper house, a good barn, a bunkhouse for the 2 hired men he employed during the busy season, and a herd of cattle that numbered in the dozens. She learned that he had been the one to sit with her father during the last days of his illness, because the nearest doctor was in Pueblo, and her father had developed the fever too quickly for word to reach the doctor in time. She learned this not because August said it dramatically, but because it came out in a matter-of-fact sentence while he was fitting a new board against the porch frame, and she had to turn away for a moment and look at the apple trees until she had herself collected again. "He talked about you," August said, and his voice had gone careful in the way of a man who is uncertain whether the information will be welcome. "Did he?" Harriet said. She turned back and took up her hammer. "He said you were the most capable person he had ever known, and that it was entirely his own fault you had grown up without him." She hit the nail with more force than strictly necessary. "He was right on both counts," she said. The conversation moved on after that to more practical territory, and she was grateful for it. In the days that followed, Harriet threw herself into the work of the farmhouse with the kind of focused energy that is half industry and half grief management. She hired a man from town named Coop Wallace, who was 60 and had hands like leather and a laconic manner she found restful, to help her deepen the well. The well project took 4 days and produced water at 18 feet, good water, cold and clean. She went to the general store and purchased supplies on a credit account she established using the deed as collateral, buying flour and salt pork and dried beans and candles and lamp oil, and the other fundamentals of a frontier winter larder. She ordered a load of firewood from the woodcutter who supplied the town, 2 full cords, and had it stacked against the east side of the house where it would be protected from the prevailing wind. She met the town, which was to say the town met her, because Caldwell Creek was the kind of community where a single woman arriving to claim a homestead was an event that generated significant interest. The postmaster told her that several people had assumed the Dawson parcel would go for sale. The feed store proprietor told her that it was a good piece of land, and that she would need to get her wheat in early in the spring if she wanted a full growing season at the elevation. Mrs. Beaumont told her, with the directness of a woman who had lived in the West long enough to consider directness a courtesy, that there were 2 men in the county who had expressed interest in acquiring the Dawson property, and that she should know their names. The names were Silas Holt and Randolph Price. Silas Holt, Mrs. Beaumont explained, was the largest cattle rancher in the county, a man who had spent 20 years systematically acquiring land around his original holdings through purchase, pressure, and occasionally through means that were not cleanly legal but were difficult to prove otherwise. Randolph Price was the county land agent, which was a position that in theory existed to facilitate fair land claims and in practice gave Price considerable leverage over the paperwork that governed who owned what. "Are these men connected?" Harriet asked. Mrs. Beaumont gave her a look that contained several volumes of information. "Mr. Holt has a great deal of money," she said. "Mr. Price has a great deal of paperwork. People with those particular assets tend to find each other useful." Harriet filed this information in the same mental ledger where she had filed the moved survey marker, and she went back to her farmhouse and thought about it for an evening. The following morning she rode into town and went to the land registrar's office, where she requested the full survey record for the Dawson parcel and the adjacent properties. The clerk, a young man named Peters who had the nervous manner of someone working in an office where things happened that he would rather not be aware of, told her it would take several days to compile the records. She told him she would wait. He told her it was really not that kind of arrangement. She sat down in the chair across from his desk and opened the book she had brought with her and said she was comfortable. She had the survey records by 2 in the afternoon. She studied them at the boarding house table that evening, and what she found confirmed the conversation at the fence line. The survey marker on the eastern boundary of the Dawson property had been recorded in its original position in the county records as recently as 1876. Sometime between 1876 and the present, it had been moved. There was no amendment to the survey on file. There was no record of a boundary adjustment petition. The fence August Townsend had built matched the position of the moved marker, which meant he had built in good faith on what he believed to be his land. The person who had moved the marker had wanted the fence to be built in the wrong place. That was a deliberate action. That was a trap set for someone, and she was not yet certain whether the intended victim was her or August or both of them. She went to see August the next morning. The Townsend Ranch was a 20-minute ride along the creek road, and it was, she noted, a well-ordered operation of the kind that grows from consistent effort over years. The house was solid and well-maintained, a 2-story structure of timber and stone with a good porch and glass in all the windows. The barn was large and in excellent repair. The pastures were neatly fenced, and the cattle in them looked healthy. 2 men were working near the barn, and they watched her approach with the incurious eyes of men who had enough of their own work to attend to. August came out of the barn when he heard her horse and stood waiting while she dismounted and tied the reins to the fence post. He was in his work clothes, a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold, and there was a smear of something dark on his forearm that suggested he had been in the middle of some mechanical task. She found herself briefly distracted by this and redirected her attention firmly to the folder of papers in her hand. She showed him the survey records. She walked him through what she had found. He listened with the focused attention of a man who does not waste attention, and when she finished his expression had done something she could not quite name, a kind of tightening around the eyes that might have been anger or might have been the recognition of something he had suspected. "Holt," he said. "That is my conclusion also," Harriet said. "He wants the creek frontage. Both of our properties have it. If I am fighting you over a boundary and you are defending yourself against me, neither of us has the energy or the resources to notice what he is actually doing." August was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you suggest?" "I suggest we go to the county surveyor together and have the boundary properly reestablished. I suggest we document the moved marker before it disappears entirely. And I suggest we do it before Randolph Price has enough time to generate whatever paperwork he is preparing to generate." August looked at her for a moment that lasted long enough to be noticeable. "You have been here less than 2 weeks," he said. "I have been observant for 26 years, Harriet replied. Something changed in his expression then, and if she had to name it, she would have said it was the beginning of respect, which is different from politeness and considerably more valuable. They rode to the county surveyor's office in Pueblo together 2 days later, a full day's ride each direction, and they were there when the office opened. The county surveyor was a man named Garrett who was precise and humorless in the manner of a person whose entire professional life consists of being accurate, and he took their evidence with the careful attention it deserved. When he examined the records and heard what Harriet had found and saw the photograph she had had made of the moved marker, his humorless face went very flat in a particular way. "This is not an accident," he said. "No," Harriet agreed. "I will send my deputy to reestablish the line within the week," he said. "And I will be filing a report with the county commissioner's office regarding the marker irregularity." They rode back in the long afternoon light, and the conversation on the road was different from the conversations they had been having. It was more relaxed, less structured by the particular wariness that 2 people maintain when they are not yet certain of each other's intentions. August told her about his first winter in Colorado, which had been brutal and had nearly killed him twice, once from cold and once from a longhorn steer that had taken exception to being moved. He described these events with a dry understatement that made her laugh, and she found that laughing felt strange, the way a muscle feels when it has not been used in a while. She told him about Kansas City, about the seamstress work and the teaching, about the particular kind of stubborn independence she had developed as a woman living alone in a city where a woman living alone was considered a problem requiring a solution by everyone except herself. He listened to all of it. "Were you not afraid?" he asked, "coming out here alone?" She considered the question seriously because he had asked it seriously. "I was afraid of being afraid," she said. "I was afraid that when I arrived I would find something so overwhelming that I would turn back. I was afraid I would not be capable of it." She paused. "But those things have not happened." "No," he said, "they have not." The county surveyor's deputy arrived on Wednesday of the following week and spent a full day re-establishing the boundary markers on the eastern edge of the Dawson property. August was present, as was Harriet, and the deputy recorded the original boundary positions and officially documented the discrepancy between the moved marker and the recorded survey. He also took a formal statement about when the fence had been built and on what basis, which August provided in full and without hesitation. When the deputy left, August walked the new boundary line with Harriet, and they stood at the place where the fence now clearly encroached on her land. "I will move it," he said. "I know," she said. "It will take a few days. I will need to reset the posts." "There is no hurry," Harriet said. "I know you will do it." He looked at her then, and there was something in that look that she had not received from many people in her life, a straightforward acknowledgement that she was a person whose word meant something and whose good opinion was worth having. It made her feel a warmth in her chest that she recognized as dangerous and declined to examine closely. The fence moving happened over 3 days, and August did most of the work himself, his 2 hired men assisting with the heavier post work. Harriet did not help with the fence, but she brought food at midday on all 3 days, because that was practical and because the farmhouse was close enough to the work that it made sense. And if she also found herself looking forward to those midday breaks with a degree of anticipation that she did not fully acknowledge to herself, that was her own business. The days they ate together over the fence project were the days she started to really know him. Not the practical facts of his life, which she had been assembling from the beginning in her orderly way, but the actual texture of the man. She learned that he read, seriously and widely, and that he had a crate of books in his house that he had hauled across 3 states when he moved. She learned that he had a habit of total stillness when he was thinking, a complete cessation of movement that was somehow more active than most people's animation. She learned that he had a dry, precise humor that arrived without fanfare and landed perfectly, and that when something genuinely amused him, it showed in his eyes before it reached his mouth. She learned that he had never married, and that this was not, as it was with some men, a sign of self-sufficiency shading into indifference to others, but rather seemed to be the result of having been too busy building something and not having been in the right place at the right time with the right person. She knew this was a dangerous avenue of thought and redirected herself firmly to the matters at hand. The matters at hand became considerably more complicated in early November. She was in town at the general store when she overheard, without intending to, a conversation between Randolph Price and the store owner. She was behind a shelf of dry goods, and they were near the front counter, and they did not know she was there. The conversation concerned a land petition that Price was preparing on behalf of a client he did not name, a petition that would claim that the Dawson parcel had been abandoned for purposes of the Homestead Act provisions regarding continuous occupancy. Price was explaining the timeline in a low voice, with the confidence of a man who has done this sort of thing before and knows which details to elide. Harriet walked around the end of the shelf and stood in front of both men. Price turned the color of old chalk. "Miss Dawson," he said. "Mr. Price," she said, "tell me about the abandonment petition." The conversation that followed was the most civil version of a confrontation Harriet had ever conducted. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten. She stated, in measured and precise language, that she was resident on the Dawson property, that she had been resident there continuously since her arrival, that she had receipts for improvements she had made to the structure and proof of the credit account she had established at the store, and that any petition claiming abandonment would be not merely wrong but demonstrably and documentably wrong in ways that would reflect badly on everyone involved in preparing it. She then said, in a tone that she had learned from 11 years of being a woman navigating systems designed without her in mind, that she assumed Mr. Price was operating under some misunderstanding about the current state of the property, and that now that the misunderstanding was cleared up, there would naturally be no further reason to pursue that particular avenue. Price looked at her for a long moment. He was a man in his late 40s with the kind of face that has been arranged into pleasantness so long that the pleasantness has become a kind of mask, and beneath the mask she could see the calculations running. "Of course," he said. She bought her flour and her lamp oil and walked back to the farmhouse. When she was a half-mile out of town and alone on the road, she stopped walking for a moment and simply breathed, because her hands were shaking very slightly, and she preferred to deal with that in private. She told August about it that afternoon. She had not planned to go to the Townsend ranch that day, but she found herself riding the creek road in the late afternoon because she needed to tell someone who would understand what it meant and would not tell her she was imagining things. He listened to the whole account standing on his porch with the flat November sky behind him, and when she finished his jaw was set in that particular way she was coming to read. "This is not going to end with one conversation," he said. "I know that. Holt will try another angle. I know that too." He looked at her with the steady gray eyes that she had come to find deeply steadying in their own right. "You are not going to leave, are you?" It was not quite a question. "No," she said. "Good," he said, and that single word carried a freight of meaning that she did not parse in that moment but held somewhere in her chest like a stone that had been warmed in the sun. November moved forward with the particular relentlessness of a Colorado high country autumn. The temperature dropped steadily, and there were 2 snowfalls in the second half of the month, neither of them deep, but both of them early enough to be a warning. Harriet prepared the farmhouse for winter with the methodical thoroughness she applied to all problems, banking the foundation with straw bales, adding a second layer of oilcloth to the windows on the north face, laying in the last of the firewood, and calculating that she had enough to carry her through to March if she was careful. She also began to understand her father better, in the way that inhabiting a person's physical space sometimes allows. She found his journals in the back of the bedroom wardrobe, 3 thick books of them spanning a decade, and she read them in the evenings by lamplight. Clement Dawson had been, the journals revealed, a man in permanent internal conflict between the life he had chosen and the family he had left behind. The journals were full of plans to go back to St. Louis that had not materialized, for reasons that were always described as temporary but never were. They were also full of the daily life of the land, the weather and the crops and the animals and the neighbors, and August Townsend appeared in them regularly as the person her father trusted most in this place. August came to help with the spring planting. He is an uncommonly decent man. Harriet would like him, I think. She sat with that entry for a long time one November evening. She was reading the journals by the kitchen window one Saturday afternoon when she heard the sound of a horse and looked up to see August riding into the yard. She went to the door before he knocked. "I was going to check on the apple trees," she said, because she had mentioned the orchard in a previous conversation and had been thinking she should get to it before the real cold set in. "I brought grafting wire," he said, producing a small coil of it from his coat pocket. "Your Gravenstein trees will need it on 2 of them before the freeze." She stared at him for a moment. "How did you know they were Gravensteins?" "Your father told me when he planted them. He was very particular about the variety." They spent the afternoon in the apple orchard, and it was the first afternoon she could remember in a long time when she was simply present in a place without the machinery of planning and problem-solving running constantly. The work was quiet and close, and he showed her what he was doing with the grafting wire with the patient clarity of someone who enjoys teaching, and the late November light fell across the dormant trees and made everything gold and gray and still. "What will you grow?" he asked. "In the spring." "Wheat primarily. The soil on the northern section is good for it from what I can see. Some kitchen vegetables. I want to get the orchard properly established, which will take several years." She paused. "And I would like to keep some chickens, perhaps eventually a milk cow." "That is a sound plan," he said. "I am a sound planner." He smiled at that, and the smile was full and unguarded in a way that was different from the measured expressions he usually wore, and she felt the warmth in her chest again, more insistent this time and less easy to redirect. "You are," he said. "You are also the most determined person I have ever met, and I grew up around people who had to be determined to survive." "Is that a compliment?" "It is an observation," he said, "though I intend it as a compliment." She looked at him in the late light, and for a moment the careful practicality she maintained around herself like a fence of her own construction came loose at a corner. "My father wrote about you," she said, "in his journals." Something moved across his face. "I did not know he kept journals." "He said you were an uncommonly decent man." She paused. "He said he thought I would like you." August was quiet for a moment, looking at the grafted apple tree, and when he looked up his expression had the quality of a man who is being very careful with something. "Your father hoped you would come," he said. "In the last year especially. He talked about writing to you more directly than he had, asking you to come see the place. He was not certain you would want to." The grief in her chest was complicated and old, and she had learned to carry it without putting it down in front of people, but something in this moment made it heavier. "I would have," she said, and her voice was steady, "if he had asked." "I know," August said. "I think he knew too. I think he was afraid you would come and then go, and that would have been harder than the distance." She thought about that for the rest of the evening after he had gone, and she thought about the distance her father had maintained as a form of protection for himself, and she thought about the distances she maintained for the same reason, and she found herself making a comparison she was not entirely comfortable with. Silas Holt appeared in person for the first time on a Wednesday in early December. He rode to the farmhouse with 2 men behind him and tied his horse at the porch rail as though the porch were his. He was a large man in his 50s, handsome in the way of men who have been powerful long enough for power to have arranged their features into something commanding, and he wore a coat that cost more than most men in the county made in a month. He introduced himself with a pleasantness that was exactly the same as Price's pleasantness, and made her exactly as watchful. "I wanted to introduce myself," he said, standing on her newly repaired porch, "and to offer my condolences on your father's passing." Clement was a good neighbor. "Thank you," Harriet said. She had not invited him inside, and he had not moved toward the door, and they were conducting this conversation in the cold air of the porch, which was where she intended to keep it. "I also wanted to extend a business proposition," Holt said. "I am always looking to expand my operation, and the Dawson parcel is a good piece of land. I could offer you a fair price, enough to set yourself up comfortably somewhere with proper amenities." He smiled. "Colorado winters are very hard, Miss Dawson. Especially for someone managing a property alone." Harriet met his eyes with the level look she had been perfecting since she was a child. "I am managing adequately, Mr. Holt. Thank you for the concern." "The offer stands," he said, "open-ended. You can take your time thinking it over." "I have thought it over," she said. "The answer is no." His smile did not change, but his eyes did, a very small shift, the way light changes when a cloud passes between it and the sun. "I hope you will reconsider," he said. "It can be very isolated out here." She recognized the word for what it was, not a description, a suggestion. "Good day, Mr. Holt," she said. She watched him ride away and then went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a full 5 minutes doing nothing, because sometimes that is the most useful thing a body can do. She told August that evening. She rode to the Townsend ranch as the last light was fading from the sky, and he came out of the house when he heard her horse and looked at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him about Holt's visit, the offer, the word isolated, The men who had ridden with him and had not spoken but had been present with the specific deliberateness of men whose presence is itself a message. August's expression during this account was the still, focused kind, and when she finished there was a pause that had the weight of a man making a decision. "You should not be out there alone," he said. "I'm not going to move in with you," she said, because she knew where this was going and she intended to control the pace of the conversation. He blinked, and something that was almost humor crossed his face before seriousness reclaimed it. "That is not what I was going to suggest," he said, "although I appreciate knowing where your mind went." She felt heat in her cheeks and was very grateful for the low light. "What were you going to suggest?" "One of my hired men, Danny Marsh, has a wife and they have been living in the bunkhouse which is not suitable for the winter. If you had room in the farmhouse, they could board with you through the cold months. You would have company and Danny would be on the premises." It was a good solution. It was a practical solution. It addressed the actual problem without creating a different one. She recognized the intelligence of it and acknowledged it to herself. "I have a spare room," she said. "I will speak to them." Danny and Alice Marsh moved into the farmhouse on the following Saturday, and Alice Marsh turned out to be a woman of 23 with red hair and a forthright manner, and a baby due in the spring, which she disclosed on the first evening with the complete lack of apology that Harriet immediately respected. Alice had grown up in Kansas and had come west with Danny 2 years ago, and had the particular combination of pragmatism and warmth that the West seemed to produce in the women who stayed in it long enough. They became friends in the rapid, deep way of women who are useful to each other and like each other, and do not have time for the slower methods. Alice, within the first week, told Harriet her observations about August Townsend with the directness of someone who has decided that the information is relevant and ought to be shared. "He has not been the same since you arrived," Alice said, one evening by the kitchen stove while Danny was outside seeing to the animals. "Danny says he was already a man who worked hard, but now he works with a different energy, and he rides over here on reasons that get less convincing every time." "He has been very helpful," Harriet said. "He has been extremely helpful," Alice agreed, with an emphasis that carried considerable meaning. "Danny says in 2 years August has never once come over just to bring wire or lumber or advice unless something went wrong. He is inventing reasons." Harriet looked at the mending in her hands. "He was a friend of my father's." "He is more than that," Alice said, "and I think you know it." Harriet did know it. She had known it for some time, with the clarity of a person who is honest with themselves, even when the honesty is inconvenient. What she was less certain about was what to do with the knowledge, because the land and the work and the practical demands of surviving a Colorado winter were real and immediate in a way that her feelings about August Townsend, however clear, seemed secondary too. And there was still the problem of Silas Holt. Holt's next move came in mid-December, and it was not a personal visit. It was a legal document, a claim filed with the county land office by Randolph Price on behalf of an unnamed client, asserting that a portion of the Dawson property's water rights on the Southern Creek frontage had been conveyed to an adjacent property owner in an unrecorded agreement with Clement Dawson sometime in 1877. The document was filed on a Friday. Harriet received a copy on Saturday morning. By Saturday afternoon, she was at the county land office demanding the basis for the claim, and by Sunday morning she was reading, at her kitchen table with Alice sitting across from her with coffee, the relevant sections of Colorado territorial water law. She found August on Monday, and they went to Pueblo on Wednesday, and this time she had a lawyer with her, a man named Edmonds who practiced from a small office above the telegraph office, and who had, upon hearing her account of the matter, said in a measured tone that this was the 3rd time in 5 years that a similar claim had appeared in connection with Silas Holt's land acquisition activities, and that he considered the timing of Harriet's legal matters to be something the county commissioner ought to be aware of. The water rights claim was filed incorrectly. The document cited a section of law that had been superseded by a 1876 territorial amendment. The signature on the alleged 1877 agreement did not match Clement Dawson's recorded signature on file, with the land office in two different details. Edmonds filed a formal challenge the same day, with a supporting document that referenced the moved survey marker and the previous abandonment petition attempt, presenting all of it as a pattern. They rode back in the dark because the business had taken longer than expected, and Harriet was tired in her bones in a way that was deeper than physical. "Do you think he will stop?" she asked. The road was dark and cold, and the stars above the mountains were extraordinary, the way they are in places where there is no other light to compete with them. "Not voluntarily," August said, "but publicly documented patterns are inconvenient for men who operate in the gaps between documentation and reality." He paused. "Edmonds is the right person to have on your side. He has a long memory." "I did not come here expecting to spend my first winter in legal battles," Harriet said. "I know. I came here expecting to repair a farmhouse and plant wheat in the spring and learn whether I could make something of this land." She paused, and the tiredness made her less careful than she usually was. "I came here because it was mine, and I had nothing else that was purely mine, and I needed something that was." The silence after that was not empty. It was the kind of silence that happens when something true has been said and both people are sitting with it. "You have made something of it already," August said quietly. "In 6 weeks, more than most people make in a year." She looked at his profile against the star-scattered sky, the set of his shoulders, the way he held the reins with a light hand that communicated trust to the horse. "You have made it easier," she said. "Considerably easier than it would have been otherwise." He was quiet for a moment. "I would like to continue to do that," he said, and the words had a careful weight to them, a deliberateness, as though he was choosing each one from a set of others he had considered and set aside. She understood what he was saying and what he was not yet saying, and she held both things with her on the cold road home. Christmas came to the high country with a foot of snow and a silence that was almost devotional. Harriet had not thought much about Christmas in advance, because her list of tasks had not included it, but Alice had thought about it extensively, and had been making preparations for weeks with a cheerful determination that had drawn Danny into the project, and eventually drawn Harriet in too. On Christmas Eve, August came to dinner at the farmhouse with a bottle of whiskey and a pair of wool blankets he had made at the general store from a bolt of fabric that was the color of winter sky. He gave one blanket to Alice and Danny, and folded the other, and set it on the table near Harriet without saying anything about it, which she found more affecting than any elaborate presentation would have been. They ate Alice's roast chicken, and the potatoes Harriet had grown in the kitchen garden before the frost, and a dried apple pie that they were all very proud of, and they drank a moderate amount of the whiskey. And Danny told a story about a cattle drive that went badly wrong in the Panhandle that somehow became funnier at each retelling. And Alice fell asleep in the chair by the stove around 9 o'clock in the manner of a woman in the final months of pregnancy for whom wakefulness is optional. August and Harriet washed the dishes together by lamplight, which was domestic and quiet and felt completely natural in a way that made Harriet's chest ache with the specific ache of wanting something and not knowing whether to reach for it. "What will next year look like?" he asked. He was drying a plate with the tea towel and his voice was conversational, but his attention was very focused. "Wheat in the north field, a proper kitchen garden, getting the apple trees properly established." She paused. "And no more legal disputes if I can manage it. You will not be able to manage that entirely on your own. I know." She handed him another plate. "I am not trying to." He set the dry plate down and turned slightly toward her, and the lamplight made everything amber and close. "Harriet," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and it landed differently than she had expected. She turned to face him. "I have been trying to find the right moment," he said, "and I have concluded that there is no right moment and that I should simply say what I mean." He paused. "I would like to court you if you are willing, properly, with your full knowledge of what I mean by it, and what I hope it might become. She stood at the kitchen basin in her farmhouse on Christmas Eve in the first year of the rest of her life, and she looked at this man who had brought her lumber and grafting wire and company and steady gray eyes in difficult moments, and she thought about her father writing in his journal that she would like him. "I am willing," she said. The smile that came across his face was the full, unguarded one she had seen in the apple orchard, and she felt the warmth in her chest expand into something that was large and steady and not frightening at all. The winter deepened in January and became the kind of cold that enforces a particular intimacy on small communities, because survival in that cold requires people to rely on each other in straightforward and practical ways. August rode over every few days, sometimes with a purpose and sometimes without one, and they sat by the kitchen stove and read and talked, while Alice knitted and Danny played cards with himself and the wind worked at the windows. The conversations ranged widely, the way conversations range when two people are genuinely interested in each other's minds. They disagreed about things, which she found she enjoyed, because he argued carefully and changed his position when she had a better point and expected the same courtesy from her. They agreed about other things with the particular satisfaction of discovering an aligned view on a question neither had expected the other to have considered. She told him things about her life in Kansas City she had not told anyone in a long time, the seamstress work and the teaching and the careful economies, and the particular loneliness of being capable and alone. He told her about Virginia and the war years and the loss of the farm and the long haul westward, and the way the homestead had become not just a business, but a way of rebuilding something he had thought was permanently gone. In February, Alice and Danny's son was born in the bedroom of the farmhouse, arriving on a Tuesday morning with the forthright energy of a person who intended to be present and was not willing to wait for more convenient circumstances. Harriet was there for the birth, and so was August, who had been at the farmhouse when Alice's labor began and had ridden to fetch the midwife from town in the middle of the night and had been back by morning. When it was over and Alice was resting and Danny was in the corner of the bedroom holding his son with the dazed expression of a new father, Harriet came out of the bedroom and found August standing by the kitchen stove with 2 cups of coffee. She took the cup he offered and sat down heavily in the chair and felt something shift in her that she had not known was held tight. "Boy or girl?" he asked. "Boy," she said. "They are calling him Clement." The name hung in the warm kitchen air, and August looked at her with the steady eyes that she had come to depend on, and she did not try to hide the way her own eyes were bright. "Your father would have liked that," August said. "He would have," she said, and she meant it without the complicated edge that any mention of her father had once carried, because the winter on this land had done something to the complication, or she had, and either way it was different now. He sat down across the table from her, and they drank their coffee in the companionable quiet of 2 people who have moved beyond the need to fill every silence. And outside the farmhouse, the Colorado winter went on in its vast and indifferent way. And inside there was warmth and new life, and the particular piece of a day on which several important things had happened. The legal case against Silas Holt's water rights claim was decided in February, a clear ruling in Harriet's favor from the Territorial District Court that referenced the procedural errors and the misquoted statute, and in language that Edmonds had clearly labored over, the pattern of irregular documentation that appeared to accompany Holt's land acquisition activities. The ruling was a matter of public record, and Edmonds made certain that it was publicized in the County Gazette. Price, whose name appeared several times in the ruling's footnotes, did not appear at the land office for 3 days following the publication. Holt made no further direct moves on the Dawson property. He was not the kind of man who made loud final surrenders, but he was also not a man who continued to invest resources in battles that were becoming publicly documented losses. The Dawson parcel was one piece of land. The legal record being built around his activities was a threat to all the others. Harriet understood this calculus, and so did Edmonds, who told her that the ruling would provide protection not just for her, but for several other small landholders in the county who had been subject to similar pressure. Spring arrived in Colorado at the end of March with a suddenness that felt like a declaration. One week the ground was frozen and the world was white and brown, and the next week there was mud and the smell of new growth, and the creek running loud with snowmelt, and the particular electricity in the air that comes from a landscape waking up. Harriet stood in the north field on the first genuinely warm morning and felt the ground yield under her boot heel in the way that means the frost is out, and she looked at the 160 acres her father had claimed and held and left to her, and felt something that was not quite her own satisfaction, and not quite his legacy, but some combination of the two that seemed more truthful than either alone. She and August planted the north field together over 4 days in early April. He brought his team and his equipment, and she supplied the seed, and the labor and the particular exacting attention she brought to every physical task, and by Thursday evening the wheat was in, and the light was long and golden over the mountains, and they were sitting on the tailgate of the wagon eating the bread and hard cheese she had brought for supper. "It is good land," he said. "It is," she said. She had known it for months, but saying it still felt like a discovery. "My father knew what he was doing when he chose it." "He chose a great many things well," August said, and the way he looked at her when he said it made the words carry more than their surface meaning. She had been waiting, she realized, for this. Not impatiently, because she was not an impatient person and she had never been in the habit of hurrying toward things she valued. But she had been aware of the waiting, the way you are aware of a note sustaining at the end of a piece of music, knowing the resolution is coming and holding very still for it. "August," she said. "Yes," he said, "not a question. I came here because this land was mine and I needed something that was mine." She looked at the field they had just planted, the dark earth and the spring sky above it. "I did not come here expecting anything else." "I know," he said, "but something else has happened," she said, "and I am not as surprised by it as I expected to be, and I think that is because some part of me knew, quite early, that it was going to." He looked at her steadily in the long April light. He was always steady, this man, and she had discovered over the winter that this quality was not flatness or absence of feeling but the opposite, a deep reservoir that did not spill easily but was very full. "I love you," he said. It was simple and direct and entirely without decoration, and it was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. "I love you too," she said. He took her hand, which was rough from weeks of work, and held it in both of his, which were rougher, and they sat on the tailgate of the wagon as the evening came on, and the mountains went purple against the darkening sky, and it was exactly as quiet and as large as it ought to have been. He asked her to marry him on a Saturday morning in May, on the porch of the farmhouse with the apple orchard blooming behind her, and a sky the color of deep water overhead. He did not do it with fanfare or elaborate ceremony. He came to the porch where she was reading and sat down in the other chair, and was quiet for a moment with the stillness she knew so well, and then he said, "I would like very much for you to be my wife, Harriet, if you are willing." She looked at him for a long moment, at the honest, weathered face and the gray eyes that had been the steadiest thing in her world for the past 7 months. She thought about her father, who had loved this land and had been loved by this man's friendship, and who had written in his journal with the handwriting that slanted uphill as though the words wanted to escape that she would like him. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." The wedding was in June, in the small Methodist church in Caldwell Creek that had a preacher who came through on the circuit every 3 weeks. Mrs. Beaumont attended, and Edmonds the lawyer, and Coop Wallace, who had helped deepen the well and who cried with the complete lack of self-consciousness of a man of 60 who has attended enough funerals to know that celebrations deserve full participation. Alice and Danny were there with baby Clement, who spent the ceremony in a state of alert curiosity about everything above his eye level. The two hired men from the Townsend ranch came in their good shirts and stood in the back with the attentiveness of men who are genuinely moved by the occasion and are not certain what to do with the feeling. Harriet wore the dress she had made herself, blue lawn with white collar points, the best work of her seamstress career, and completed in 6 evenings by lamplight. August wore a dark coat and a clean white shirt, and an expression throughout the ceremony that she would remember the rest of her life. When the preacher pronounced them married, August kissed her with a gentleness that held everything they had said and done and been to each other in the months behind them, and she kissed him back with the same, and Mrs. Beaumont produced a handkerchief, and Coop Wallace made a noise that was technically a cough. The question of the two properties was one they had discussed at length during the winter months, and had resolved in a way that satisfied both of them. The Dawson farmhouse and the Dawson parcel remained Harriet's property in her name, because the land was hers and she had fought for it, and it would remain hers as a matter of both law and principle. They would work both properties as a joined operation, the wheat on the Dawson North field and the cattle on the Townsend pastures, and the shared labor of a life built together. She would keep the farmhouse maintained as an ongoing part of the operation, not a secondary property, but an extension of what they were building together. She would not be absorbed into someone else's life. She would be adding her life to his and his to hers, and the arithmetic of that would produce something larger than either of them had been before. They moved into the Townsend house together after the wedding, and Harriet spent the first week learning its spaces and making them her own, not replacing what was there but adding herself to it. Her books alongside his in the crate that had crossed 3 states, her kitchen methods practiced on his kitchen stove, her voice in the rooms that had previously held only his. He watched her do this with a happiness he did not try to hide. The wheat came in well in August, better than she had dared to hope for a first year, and they spent 3 days harvesting it with help from Danny Marsh, and a neighbor from 5 miles out named Felix Crowder, who came in exchange for help with his own hay later in the season. The granary at the Townsend ranch held the harvest, and Harriet stood in the granary doorway looking at the bagged grain, and did the calculations in her head, and found that they added up to a real beginning. The apple orchard she had grafted in November produced no fruit that first year, which was not unexpected, but all 5 trees were healthy and growing, and the Gravenstein variety her father had chosen was known for its hardiness. In another year or 2, there would be apples. She was patient about it. Some things take the time they take. Summer in the high country was different from anything she had previously known. The days were long and brilliant, and the nights were cold even in July, and the mountains were always present in a way that she had initially found oppressive and had come to find anchoring. She rode out on summer mornings on the horse August had helped her select and trained with her over the spring months, and the rides through the property and the adjoining public land were the kind of solitary and physical freedom she had not experienced before coming here, a freedom that was not the freedom of loneliness, but the freedom of belonging somewhere and being able to move through it. She wrote letters. She wrote to her aunt in Kansas City, long letters that described the land and the work and the wedding and the people, and her aunt wrote back with a warmth that surprised Harriet slightly and probably should not have. She wrote to her friend Louisa, who had called this an adventure and been exactly right, and Louisa's letters back were full of questions and enthusiasm and the specific delight of a friend who is happy for you. She wrote occasionally to Edmonds in Pueblo, keeping the legal records current, because Silas Holt had not disappeared, and she was not a woman who let her guard down entirely on the basis of recent quiet. Holt, as it turned out, was having legal difficulties of a different kind by the autumn of 1880. The county commissioner's investigation that Edmonds had set in motion with his documented pattern argument had expanded during the summer months, and 2 other landholders who had sold to Holt under what they now characterized as duress had come forward with their accounts. Price had resigned from the county land office in August, which was the kind of action that constitutes an admission of something without formally being one. The investigation was ongoing as the year turned. By October, Harriet was pregnant. She told August on a Tuesday evening after supper, directly in the way she did everything, and his face went through several things rapidly before settling on a happiness that was so complete and so undefended that she felt her own throat go tight with it. "Are you well?" he asked, which was the first thing he said, and it was the right first thing. "I am very well," she said. He took her hands across the table. "Are you frightened?" She considered the question honestly. "A little," she said. "But not more than I am glad." He smiled at that with a full smile. "Good," he said. "That is the right proportion." The winter of 1880 to 1881 was harder than the previous one, a deep cold that arrived early and stayed long, and they spent it snowed in more often than not, which was not an unpleasant thing when you had firewood and food and someone good to be snowed in with. They read aloud to each other in the evenings, trading turns with the books, and she discovered that he had a fine reading voice that did full justice to the texts, and that this was something she had somehow never anticipated and was very glad to know. They played cards and argued amicably about politics and weather, and the relative merits of different approaches to soil preparation. And some evenings they simply sat in the same room reading separately, and said almost nothing, and that was also very good. Alice and Danny had moved out of the farmhouse and into town, where Danny was working for the livery, but they came for Sunday dinners regularly, and young Clement was developing into a person with opinions about everything, which Alice reported with the resigned delight of a mother who has produced exactly what she expected. The winter passed, and spring came again with its mud and smell and long light, and the second year was easier in the way that second years are when you have survived the first one. The wheat went in with more confidence and more seed than the year before, and Harriet managed the planting from the saddle rather than on foot, being further along than was entirely comfortable for the heavy work. The apple orchard showed its first blossoms, and she went out to see them on the first morning they opened, and stood among the 5 trees in the spring light, feeling a continuity that she recognized as belonging to this place, and to her father and to herself, and to the child she was carrying, all of it one unbroken thread. Their son was born in June of 1881, in the upstairs bedroom of the Townsend house, delivered by the midwife from town and attended by August, who remained present throughout with the stillness and steadiness that were the core of his character, and which Harriet was deeply grateful for in that particular circumstance. The child was healthy and large, and arrived with the decisive announcement of someone who has been waiting long enough and is ready. They named him Clement August Townsend. August held him in the hour after his birth with the careful tenderness of a man handling something he cannot believe is real, and Harriet watched him from the bed where she was exhausted and entirely happy, and thought that this was the most complete thing she had ever seen. "Hello," August said to the baby, quietly, as though continuing a conversation he had been thinking about for some time. "We have been waiting for you." Young Clement, who would be called Clem to distinguish him from his grandfather's memory and his own eventual personality, was from his first weeks a person of considerable alertness and considerable appetite, and he reorganized the household around himself with the complete selfishness of infants and the particular charm that makes that selfishness acceptable. August, who had not spent significant time around babies before, adapted to fatherhood with the same methodical competence he applied to every challenge, and was capable of settling Clem from a crying state to a sleeping one at 3 in the morning, in a manner that Harriet both appreciated practically and found affecting in ways she did not always have words for. The Holt investigation concluded in the spring of 1882 with a ruling by the territorial court that Silas Holt had engaged in fraudulent land acquisition practices, affecting 11 properties over a period of 15 years. Several of the acquisitions were voided. Holt paid substantial fines and lost two of the properties that had been most clearly obtained through irregular means. He retained the bulk of his operation, because men of his resources and the duration of their establishment are difficult to fully dismantle, but his pattern of expansion was over, and his influence in county land matters was effectively ended. Price left the territory entirely. Edmonds wrote to Harriet with a full account of the ruling, and she read the letter at the kitchen table with August across from her and Clem conducting an independent investigation of the chair leg between them. "It is not everything," she said. "No," August agreed, "but it is enough." "It is more than enough," he said. "It is the record. It is the documented truth, which is what you built it toward from the beginning." She set the letter down and looked at her husband and her son and the kitchen of the house that had become entirely theirs, and she thought about what she had come west for. She had come for land. She had come because it was hers and she had nothing else that was purely hers. She had come because her father had left her something, and she intended to honor the inheritance even if the relationship that produced it had been complicated and mostly conducted at a distance. She had found the land and she had found the work, and she had found the legal battles and the neighbors and the community, and the cold and the light and the apple trees. She had found August Townsend, who had brought her lumber on the second morning and had not let her struggle from that moment forward, not because she was incapable of the struggle, but because he had understood, in the practical and undemonstrative way that was entirely his own, that not struggling alone is different from not being able to stand on your own. She had found a home, not a place she had been assigned or had drifted to or had ended up by accident. A home she had chosen and fought for and made with her own hands and her own determined, capable self, alongside a man who had seen all of that from the beginning and had considered it, in his word, a compliment. The apple trees gave fruit for the first time that autumn of 1882, and she picked the first Gravenstein apple of the harvest herself on a September morning with Clem on her hip and August beside her, and the mountains in their September state of absolute authority behind them all. She bit into the apple and it was sharp and sweet in the way of the Gravenstein variety, exactly as her father had planted it to be, and she stood in the orchard her father had begun and she had continued and thought that this was what it means to inherit something truly, not to receive it, to complete it. "It is good," she said. "It is," August agreed, and she knew he was not only talking about the apple. She handed Clem a small piece, which he regarded with the deep suspicion of a 1-year-old encountering a new food, and then consumed with the enthusiasm of someone who has discovered that the world contains more pleasures than previously inventoried. They stood in the orchard for a long time after that, the three of them, in the September light, and there was nothing left unresolved between them and nothing unsettled in the life they had made, and the mountains stood in their indifferent and beautiful way behind everything. And the harvest was in and the wheat was sold and the legal record was clean and the fence was on the right line, and the well was good and deep, and the farmhouse was theirs, and the Townsend house was theirs, and all of it together was exactly what it should be. By the following spring Harriet knew there was another child coming, and she told August over breakfast on a March morning with the particular directness she had applied to every significant piece of information she had ever delivered to him, and he looked up from his coffee with the happiness that she now knew was his particular happiness, the one that was entirely undefended and entirely real. "Are you well?" he asked, again. Because that was always his first question, and she had come to love it for exactly that reason. "Very well," she said, and she was. Their daughter arrived in October of 1883, red-haired like Alice Marsh, as though the color had been waiting in the genetic inheritance for exactly the right moment, and she arrived with the decisive energy of a person who intends to be present, which she demonstrated immediately and consistently. They named her Eleanor, after August's mother, who had been a woman he described as having a quality he called fierce quiet, which he said their daughter already seemed to have mastered. Clem, who was 2, regarded Alina with the complex assessment of a firstborn encountering competition, and then, over the following weeks, with a gradually increasing interest that resolved into the particular protective fierceness of an older sibling that would come to define their relationship through all the years ahead. The Dawson parcel in those years became what Harriet had imagined it could be. The wheat fields established themselves over successive seasons, improved each year as she learned the specific rhythms of the soil and the elevation. The kitchen garden was excellent from the second year onward. The apple orchard grew and expanded because she grafted additional trees from the original 5, and by the middle of the decade there were 9 trees and the harvest was substantial enough to sell the surplus in town. The farmhouse was fully restored and kept in good repair, and during the busy seasons Danny Marsh, who had returned to ranch work, used it as a bunkhouse, and there was a rightness to the building being occupied and useful that Harriet felt every time she walked the perimeter. August's cattle operation grew steadily through the first half of the decade, and the 2 properties working together as a single operation, sharing labor and equipment across what was legally 2 separate parcels, but practically one life, produced a stability and a sufficiency that neither of them had been certain they would achieve when they were starting separately and under pressure. They argued sometimes, as 2 strong-willed and opinionated people will, about methods and decisions and the occasional interpretation of events, and the arguments were real ones with substance and sometimes with heat. But they also always ended in the way that arguments between people who respect each other end, with the willingness to change position when the other person had a better argument, or to acknowledge that both positions had merit and find the third thing, or occasionally simply to disagree and proceed on the agreed course, and see what actually happened. She wrote to her aunt regularly, and her aunt visited twice, the second visit in 1884 when Alina was an infant and Clem was 3, and the ranch was in full summer operation, and her aunt walked the Dawson North Field and stood in the apple orchard and sat on the porch of the farmhouse and was very quiet for a long time before she said that she understood now why Harriet had not sold it. "Your father chose well," her aunt said, "even if he could not stay around to see it through." "He stayed around long enough to plant the orchard," Harriet said, "and to know August, and to write about it." She paused. "The rest was mine to do." Her aunt looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has watched someone she loves come fully into themselves. "Yes," she said, "the rest was yours." Louisa from Kansas City came to visit in the summer of 1885, a long trip made in the company of her own husband whom she had married in 1882, and the 2 women spent 3 days talking in the way that close women friends talk when they have been apart a long time and have a great deal to cover. Louisa walked every inch of the Dawson parcel and the Townsend ranch and met Clem and Alina and August, and said to Harriet privately, on the second evening, while the men were on the porch and the children were asleep, that she had known the West was going to agree with Harriet, but she had not known it was going to produce all of this. "You are happy," Louisa said, and she said it with the slightly wondering tone of someone confirming something they had hoped but not been entirely certain of. "I am very happy," Harriet said, and the simplicity of the statement was itself the evidence, because Harriet Townsend, née Dawson, was not a woman who said things she did not mean. The years turned, and the children grew, and the work went on in the way of honest work, requiring everything and returning everything in kind. Clem became, by the age of 8, a small and serious person who understood the land the way you understand a language learned very young, in the body as much as the mind, and who followed August around the ranch with the focused attention of an apprentice who takes the work seriously. Alina became, by the same age, a person of formidable intellectual curiosity and considerable stubbornness, who taught herself to read before she was 5 and announced at 7 that she intended to be a doctor, which Harriet received without blinking, and with the internal note that this was entirely plausible and ought to be encouraged. The Gravenstein apple orchard was the thing that gave Harriet the most sustained pleasure over those years, in the way that the slow things sometimes become the deepest satisfactions. She extended it to 12 trees by 1886, and the orchard became a place where she went in the early mornings of the seasons when it was alive, to walk among the trees and feel the particular continuity of a thing that was her father's beginning and her tending and her children's inheritance. She brought Clem and Alina there separately and together over the years, and told them about Clement Dawson, who had planted the original 5 trees, and who had written letters that slanted uphill, and who had known what he was doing even when he could not be present to see it through. The Townsend family, which was also the Dawson legacy, which was also a particular piece of Colorado high country in the late decades of the 19th century, grew into itself with the steady intention of people who have decided what they are building and are building it. In 1887, Harriet planted a new section of the kitchen garden with herbs she had been reading about for medicinal use, partly because Alina's announcement about becoming a doctor had made her think about what knowledge a girl in this territory would need and where it might be acquired, and partly because the practical use of what grew in the ground was something she had been wanting to expand. August built her a proper greenhouse against the south wall of the Townsend house that winter, a small glass and timber structure that was the most beloved building on the property from the day it went up, because it meant green things in January and the smell of growing plants through the deep cold months. They had one more child, a second son born in the spring of 1888 whom they named James, after August's father. James was born with a disposition so genuinely cheerful that it surprised everyone in the household, because the household was composed largely of serious and somewhat intense people, and the arrival of a person who seemed to find the entire world broadly amusing was a revelation. Clem, who was 7, regarded him with puzzlement that shaded into affection. Alina, who was 5, appointed herself his educator from his first weeks, with a gravity that James consistently failed to apply to the curriculum. August, watching James on a spring morning when the baby was 3 months old and had just succeeded in making the dog do something unexpected, said quietly to Harriet that he thought James had his grandfather's capacity for finding the world hospitable. "Which grandfather?" Harriet asked. "Both of them," August said, and she thought about that for a moment and then agreed. The summer of 1888 was a good summer, the wheat the best they had grown, the orchard in its fullest productivity, the cattle herd at its highest number. Harriet stood at the boundary of the north wheat field on a July afternoon with the grain waist-high, and the sky enormous, and the mountains in their permanent background authority, and she thought about the October morning 7 years before when she had stood at a disputed fence line with a deed in her hand, and a neighbor who had looked at her over his horse's neck with an expression she had not been able to read. She understood it now. She had understood it for a long time. It had been the expression of a man who was very carefully deciding whether to feel what he was feeling, and who had concluded almost immediately that he was. She heard him before she saw him, his footsteps in the grass at the field's edge, and she did not turn because she knew the sound and she knew he would come stand beside her. He did. They looked at the wheat field together. 7 years, she said. 7 good years, he said. She turned and looked at him, at the face she knew as well as she knew her own, weathered deeper now and with more lines at the corners of the gray eyes, still entirely steady, still full in the way of a reservoir that does not spill easily. "I came here to claim something," she said. "I did not expect to build something." "The two are not mutually exclusive," he said. "No," she said, "they are not." She took his hand. "I am glad you brought lumber." He looked at her with the full smile that was still, after 7 years, the thing she most wanted to see. "So am I," he said, "every single day." The afternoon light moved across the wheat, and the mountain stood, and the creek ran along the southern edge of her father's land and her children's future, and the dispute, and the hard winter, and the legal fights, and all the complicated grief, and the long road from Kansas City were all part of the same fabric as the orchard and the greenhouse and the farmhouse and this man beside her. All of it one thing. Hers and his and theirs and the world's best version of itself on this particular piece of high country Colorado ground. She held August's hand in the July afternoon, and the wheat field went on in every direction, and nothing was unresolved. The land was claimed. The life was built. The love was everything she had not known to look for and had found anyway, in the only place she had ever been entirely herself. That was enough. That was everything.